So our aims for today are, initially we are going to look at definitions and terminology around adult family violence. I'm aware that many of you may not have come across this term before, so we're going to locate it within the broader definition that we have in England and Wales around domestic abuse. We're going to explore the prevalence of adult family violence. Most of us, myself included, as an early years practitioner, defaulted to the idea of a male perpetrator, a female victim as part of an intimate relationship, and that was domestic abuse for me at that time. But as practice has developed, my experience has developed, it's become obvious that that isn't the end all and be all to domestic abuse, and there are significant cohorts of individuals who are impacted by domestic abuse that typically we don't conceptualize in the same way as we would victims and perpetrators of intimate partner violence. We're going to look briefly at the impact of adult family violence and what does that mean for survivors and victims and their children. Before we move on to theories, now, why would I include theories of domestic abuse in this presentation? Well, first of all, I think they're interesting. I think they have an application in practice. A theory is only as good as its application. And what I hope to do in that session is kind of broaden your horizons with regards to causality. Again, most of us through training have developed notions of power and control and patriarchy, which are absolutely fantastic and are applicable to an awful lot of domestic abuse. But there are certain aspects of what we understand to be domestic abuse which don't fit neatly into that power and control, that patriarchal dynamic. So we'll spend a wee while exploring that. Before we move on to risks and risk assessment, and in this part of the presentation we'll be exploring what is different and what is the same in terms of intimate partner violence and adult family violence, and what risks we should be looking for as practitioners charged with responding to issues of adult family violence. We'll then move on to look at the synergies between adult family violence and intimate partner violence. Again, what is the same, what is different, what should you as practitioners be looking out for? Before we move on to responses, what should you do if you are faced or you suspect that adult family violence is occurring within a family or with individuals that you are working with? So I hope that's pretty simple to follow, both in terms of the schedule and the topics we're going to cover. As I said earlier, if you have any questions, please type them into the live chat so I can respond to them at the end of the first break and during the plenary. For those who care about such things, if we were making reference to the NICE guidance in terms of multi-agency training, this would be a level 3 training. All that means is we've moved beyond the simple what is domestic abuse and how do we respond. We're now looking in depth at some of the aspects which underpin adult family violence. And again, I'm very conscious of what David said in terms of the introduction. What I'm talking about today has real world applications. Unfortunately, I'm far too familiar with the number of domestic homicides where adult family violence has been a determining factor. Certainly when I was in practice with Cambridge County Council and Peterborough City Council, we saw a significant proportion of what came to the high-end services, the IDVAs and the MARAC and the ISVAs. We saw a significant proportion of those cases coming to us as adult family violence. If I'm being honest, we really struggled to respond appropriately in practice to both risk and need, and that remains at the forefront of my mind. Why did we struggle? What was it that was stopping us responding to need appropriately? And that is kind of the main driver for today. What I'm hoping you take from today's session is a better understanding of the dynamics, the risk, but also how to respond best to issues of adult family violence. I'm hoping it's not going to be too complex, certainly in terms of responses. There shouldn't be anything new there. I'm conscious that some of you will have more knowledge than others about local responses, so I'll try and keep it as generic as possible and keep the messages as simple as I am able to do. So, moving on, let us now explore terminology. It's always helpful as an academic or a practitioner to define our terms, especially in terms of academia, so we all know what it is we're talking about. There's no space for ambiguity. Having said that, unfortunately, you will note from the first bullet point that there's currently no consensus definition which is appropriate to what I term adult family violence. So you've heard me mention already that adult family violence is encapsulated in our national definition of domestic abuse, and we'll visit that in a wee while. It's also known predominantly in the United States and Australia as family-related violence. Another terminology I came across recently was intrafamilial violence, which I'm not massively keen on because it's difficult to say. And some of you will be more familiar with terms such as elder abuse, which is appropriate to a significant proportion of the adult family violence cases that come our way, come through our front door, but certainly doesn't kind of cover all of the eventualities because it's targeted predominantly at older people. And as we will see, especially in terms of domestic homicides, it's not really older people who are victimized in that way. So, the Home Office definition, which we'll move on to in a wee while, which is currently part of the draft domestic abuse bill, so will be becoming a statutory definition in the not too distant future, has received criticism both from academics and from HMIC FRS. And the reason I'm flagging this is just to show the kind of divergent sources of this criticism. Now, those of you who have been around for a while will remember the cross-governmental definition that we had prior to 2012, which was short and sweet, to say the very least. Now, prior to the Brexit referendum, we all know how well that went. The previous largest referendum or consultation that was undertaken in this country by the Home Office was to develop the new definition, and by new I'm saying the 2012 definition. And back in the day, central government still had an awful lot of money, and they sent out a big red bus, sounds familiar, a big red bus round to the various shires to undertake this consultation with practitioners and stakeholders to develop a fuller and more comprehensive definition for practitioners to use. Now, there are some good things and there are some bad things about the new definition. One of the bad things is that when you ask a whole range of practitioners for their experience, what we end up with is a kind of mishmash of various wishes and desires in terms of what individuals wanted to see in that definition. So as with the Brexit referendum, what we've ended up with is a kind of an uneasy balance between practitioners' wishes and the need to get something out there which actually covers all of the aspects of domestic abuse equally. So we'll come on to that in a wee while. We'll look in a bit more depth at what those issues are on the next slide. And just to kind of underline the issues with terminology, you may be familiar with the terms parricide and matricide, so the murder of a father or a mother. There is no terminology for the killing of an aunt or an uncle. So we're still in the dark to some degree in terms of adequately defining our terms and being sure we know what it is we're actually talking about, because as we will see through the rest of this presentation, the dynamics between adult family violence and intimate partner violence, and intimate partner violence does what it says on the tin. It's violence and abuse between current or former intimate partners, spouses, etc., boyfriend, girlfriend. There are an awful lot of similarities, but there are some significant differences. So I'm hoping you're all familiar with the current cross-governmental definition, and I've highlighted here just some of the issues that bear closer review, exploration, if you like. So, any incident or pattern of incidents. Okay, that's fine-ish. But there is a scale in which all domestic abuse kind of operates, if you like. And any incident is helpful in certain terms, it's unhelpful in others. Now, I'll just elaborate on that in a wee while. So those of you who've been trained in domestic abuse, and especially in coercive and controlling behaviours, will be familiar with the idea that domestic abuse escalates over time. And if you imagine an escalating curve, so typically relationships form in the same way. It's flowers and chocolates and trips to the cinemas, etc., etc. From a positive perspective. From a slightly more negative perspective, we know that certain perpetrators will form relationships. It's known as a honeymoon period, if you like, will form relationships until they are comfortable enough to start perpetrating the abuse and violence against their intimate partners or other family members. And typically what we see in terms of a pattern there is that pattern escalates over time till either the individual is able to terminate that relationship, or something more untoward happens, or there is an intervention which kind of addresses the issue. So we're familiar with that. We are less familiar with patterns which don't escalate over time, but which tend to follow a wave pattern. So if you can imagine a wave with peaks and troughs, what we see in those troughs are periods of relative calm. There is an absence of physical violence. The emotional and psychological abuse may kind of diminish somewhat over time, but then we see a spike again, and then a trough, and then a spike again. And Michael P. Johnson, an American academic, has developed a theory that those types of relationships which are more incidental and follow that wave pattern should be considered as situational. And what he means by situational is those incidents can be triggered by mental health issues, substance misuse issues, other stresses and strains, which don't form part of a coercive and controlling dynamic. The other issue we have with the definition in terms of any incident, and I've said previously that domestic abuse, all domestic abuse, operates on a kind of sliding scale or a continuum, if you like. Now, the issue with any incident, and it's certainly an issue for colleagues within the police and children's social care and adult social care, is, and this is a generalization, but we typically are all capable of perpetrating an incident of domestic abuse within our familial or intimate relationships. Certainly, I am no saint. There are times in my past where I've responded negatively to all kinds of issues, and I could have sworn at my partner or sworn at my mother, not in a particularly violent way, but certainly in an aggressive way. By definition, that is an incident of domestic abuse. And I'm just using this to illustrate this continuum, this scale. And as practitioners, we need to be conscious of this scale and where the issues we are responding to are situated on that scale, because according to Evan Stark and his theories on coercive and controlling behaviours, that escalation that doesn't stop, and that kind of brings a whole new dynamic to risk and to need, and certainly in terms of targeted intervention. According to Johnson, the pattern of incidents or the situational incidents, it's a different dynamic, it's a different level of need, and there are strengths within these relationships. So the troughs that I've mentioned, for example, if we were to respond to these types of abusive relationships from a strengths-based perspective, what we would tend to do is work around those troughs. So what are the protective factors? What are the dynamics? What's happening within those troughs? that we can use a strengths-based approach to work with the family or work with the individual. Obviously, a coercive and controlling relationship, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to identify those strengths and work in a safe way with all parties concerned. But in the situational type domestic abuse, there are opportunities for intervention where risk is somewhat diminished. I hope that's clear. I know it's quite a complex thing to get your head around within the first couple of slides, but if you've got any questions on kind of the differentiation between patterns and incidents, please raise those questions in the live chat or keep them to the plenary. Now, just moving on with the definition, we're quite happy with the idea of, well, happy being perhaps the wrong word, but we're familiar with the ideas of controlling, coercive or threatening behaviour, violence or abuse. Now, the next highlighted point I'd like to bring to your attention here is that the definition only applies to those aged 16 or over. Now, I understand where that came from. As I've said, the consultation that the government undertook in 2012, there were an awful lot of practitioners, myself included, who were very familiar with the idea of younger people perpetrating violence and abuse against family members or their boyfriends and girlfriends. I recall as a practitioner in 1999, I wrote a paper for the New Connections Service then on this issue. I had a number of young people, predominantly male, but not always, who were using violence and abuse in their family environment and also with their boyfriends and girlfriends. I think the youngest I worked with was around 13, but I also recall a documentary, I think it was from about 1997. It was Donald McIntyre. I don't know if you remember Donald McIntyre, the investigative journalist, who did a documentary up in the Wirral. And what he found there was there were young people as young as 6 or 7 who were being violent and abusive towards their carers. So it's certainly an entrenched issue. It's certainly not an unusual issue. The arbitrary age of 16 was chosen to reflect the age at which individuals can get married in the UK. But certainly, in my experience, it's not massively helpful in terms of the fact that it creates this grey area between children and adult services, and safeguarding issues are confused and compounded by this age of 16, and it creates contradictions in terms of responses for young people who are by legislation entitled to access children's services, but the services that are actually being provided with are predominantly adult services. You may also be familiar with the Adolescents Violence Against Parents and Carers guidance, which came out from the Home Office around 2012-2013. So there is at least some recognition that young people below the age of 16 are perpetrating against parents and carers, boyfriends and girlfriends. The recognition that family members, which is the next highlighted point, are also perpetrating against other family members is perhaps less visible in terms of the policy and guidance. And we'll explore that in a wee while and ask ourselves the question, well, why do we have the DASH risk assessment, the domestic abuse, stalking and harassment risk assessment, which targets intimate partner violence, where the predominant victim is a female, predominant perpetrator is a male. Why don't we have an adult family violence risk assessment? Why is our policy, our national policy, our national strategy and violence against women and girls with a focus on intimate partner violence? Why are we not recognizing that other family members, regardless of gender or sexuality, are perpetrating and are victimized? Now, from personal experience, and I mentioned these kind of grey areas, these grey zones, which have arisen unintentionally. Nobody set out to design policy to be contradictory or confusing for practitioners. Certain things, structural things, have changed over the years. Some of you may remember the No Secrets report, which was highly influential, came out at the start of the last decade, seems an awful long time ago now, and the restructures around adult social care and adult safeguarding, which followed that report. Now, historically, a lot of the what we used to call vulnerable adults who were victims of adult family violence would have been referred to and would have received a service from adult social care prior to 2010, 2011. With the change in structure, with the change in policy, and with the change in thresholds, what we created unintentionally was a cohort of victims and survivors who have needs, but those needs are not predominantly health-based. They don't fit thresholds. They don't fit definitions. So from a practice perspective, in terms of responding, we were suddenly, in terms of specialist domestic abuse services, responding to a significant cohort of need that we really weren't set up to do. The IDVAs and the MARACs, for example, were not really designed to respond to what we could call, in the loosest sense, adult safeguarding issues. Were more designed to respond to intimate partner violence. And we're quite slow in catching up to this definition in terms of responding to family members who perpetrate or are victimised, and that's why I was delighted to take the offer forward in terms of delivering this masterclass today. In terms of the rest of the definition, you'll be familiar with kind of the types of abuse which are perpetrated across all issues of domestic abuse: psychological, physical, sexual, financial, emotional. For those of you with a keen eye, you may note that I have neglected to include the rest of the definition, which is relevant to honour-based violence, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, etc., because today I really want to focus on the violence and abuse which is more prevalent than those significant but somewhat kind of niche areas of the definition. So hopefully I haven't confused you too much thus far in terms of terminology, and I apologise if you think I'm labouring the point, but a lot of what is to follow, a lot of the discussions we're about to have are actually stem from this definition. So just to move on and look more specifically at the kind of what academics think about the definition. Now, I don't know how many of you come across the work of Liz Kelly and Nicole Westmoreland. Nicole Westmoreland teaches at the University of Durham, my neck of the woods. Liz Kelly teaches at the London Met, both highly influential feminist academics. And Kelly and Westmoreland argue that the current definition denies the gendered analysis of male violence against women and girls. It downgrades forms of violence disproportionately experienced by minority women, which I'm guilty of, because I've just said I neglected to include honour-based violence, female genital mutilation and forced marriage. But the key one here, and the kind of the bullet point that I have highlighted from Kelly and Westmoreland, criticise the definition because they argue that it assumes that the dynamics in intimate partner violence are the same as those of family violence by family members, so between siblings, between parents and children. Now, I have a lot of time for Kelly and Westmoreland, and I like their critique of the national definition. But what I would say, and what I would like you to bear in mind for the rest of the session, is what is the same and what is different between the dynamics of intimate partner violence and adult family violence. Kelly and Westmoreland back in 2014 are arguing that there is an assumption that they are the same. What I'm hoping you take from today's class is, yes, there are similarities, but there are some key differences as well. And we need to bear in mind that when Kelly and Westmoreland were writing, this was 6 years ago, and things have moved on. Perhaps not as quickly as we'd like them to, but things are moving on in terms of how we conceptualize and how we respond to all domestic abuse. The next bullet point you'll see reiterates the point that I was making around how problematic terminology around incident or patterns were. Now, where Kelly and Westmoreland are coming from here is they're assuming, they're making an assumption that intimate partner violence is based on that that notion of coercive and controlling behaviours. But I've already flagged with you that there are academics, and I agree with these academics. We'll look at the theory in a wee while, and I'll kind of discuss why I agree, that not all domestic abuse follows the same pattern, and there are cases of domestic abuse, a significant percentage of domestic abuse, which are incidental, or as Johnson has called it, situational. And then the final bullet point, which I draw your attention to here, is that the list of forms of violence abuse is vague and arguably outdated. I wouldn't disagree with that, certainly in terms of kind of the increase in technology and use of social medias and smartphones, etc., etc. There are many, many more ways to perpetrate domestic abuse now than there were historically. So, if you are confused, and bear with me, this slide will speak to some of you and not to others. It's very culturally specific. This is Dot and Nick Cotton, for those of you who aren't aware. Now, I haven't actually watched EastEnders since I got married, which was in 2002. I'm not a fan in any way, shape or form, but I thought, for those of you who are aware with these two characters, just in terms of helping you get your head around what it is we're going to be talking about for the rest of the session, I just want you to reflect on what you saw on TV in EastEnders. I mean, Nick and Dot, I think, were two of the original characters in EastEnders. Nick had mental health problems. He had substance misuse issues. He was violent. He was abusive. He was devious, and he perpetrated predominantly against his mum for a long period of time. And that abuse was violent. It was psychological. It was emotional, and it was coercive and controlling. Now, at the time, we didn't know any of this. This was just two fictional characters. This was Nasty Nick and this was Dot, and it was provided to us via the BBC as entertainment. Now, on reflection, and I would advise any of you who are not familiar with these characters to go and have a look at some clips on YouTube. On reflection, what EastEnders was doing was raising awareness of adult family violence. It wasn't, I don't think it was a conscious decision. I don't think it was by design, but certainly in terms of a case study, and if it helps you conceptualize what I've been talking about thus far, I'd encourage you to go and have a look at some of those YouTube clips. Now, while we're on this point in terms of awareness raising, we will come back to this later on. You may or may not be familiar that the Home Office does actually influence soaps in terms of their storylines in line with our national strategy. So I've mentioned since 2012, we've had an End Violence Against Women and Girls national strategy. We're in our second iteration of that strategy. And if you look at the fine detail in the action plan, what you'll see is the Home Office have influenced the likes of EastEnders and Coronation Street and what's the one I always forget? It's based up near Liverpool. Oh, it's for younger people. It's gone. It escapes my mind. But anyway, the point is that when we see storylines in these soaps, Hollyoaks was the show I was searching for, the government tries to influence directly these storylines to raise awareness. So the most recent Coronation Street storyline, which again I'm not massively familiar with, I don't think I've seen for over 20 years, but I've been following kind of the updates. So there's been a coercive and controlling storyline there where the perpetrator has been using tech and webcams to spy and coercively control his partner. We've seen similar storylines in EastEnders. We have seen female perpetrator storylines, etc., etc., etc. You may also have come across some short movies that the BBC produced called Murdered by My Boyfriend or Murdered by My Father. Again, I don't know whether you're aware, but these are the Home Office attempts to raise awareness of these issues. And what I'd really like to see, and the reason I'm kind of labouring this point, what I'd really like to see is the Home Office do something similar with adult family violence, but be more, what's the word I'm looking for? Be more transparent about what it is they're doing and why they're trying to do it. Because when we move on to look at the prevalence and impact, what we'll see is the prevalence is significant, as are the impacts. And I think it's now time for the Home Office to raise more awareness about the issue of family violence. for practitioners and also for the general public. We know that the vast majority of survivors of domestic abuse don't report their experiences to statutory agencies or the police, and we also know that the vast majority of survivors of all types of domestic abuse are much more likely to disclose to a family member or a friend or a bystander. So we need to equip not just our workforces but also our communities to understand that adult family violence is a type of domestic abuse, and it deserves and requires a response in exactly the same way as intimate partner violence or coercive and controlling relationships do. The prevalence of adult family violence. Now, the health warning here, if you like, is there is very, very little research into academic research or practice-based research into the issue of adult family violence generally, certainly in comparison to the research which has been undertaken around intimate partner violence. In terms of percentages, I would say 98% of all the research that you will see is focused on intimate partner violence, with the absolute minority focusing on adult family violence. There are some significant and some very good academics working on this issue. Amanda Holt down at the University of Sussex, for example, has done some really good work, predominantly with older survivors, looking at the prevalence, the impact, and the dynamic. But she's one of the very few. Her conclusion is that it's currently impossible to accurately measure the prevalence of adult family violence. Now, that may seem to be unsatisfactory, but to put it in its broader context, we actually have no idea really about the prevalence of domestic abuse overall. We have contradictory and divergent data sets. What do I mean by that? Well, agency data tells us one thing, survey data typically tells us another thing. In terms of agency data, for example, we know most of the research around domestic abuse, certainly in terms of quantitative data, so numbers, comes to us via the police, which is fine. It's great that we have a reasonably robust data set there, but the Inspectorate of Police, HMIC FRS, as they currently now are, tell us that the police under-record domestic abuse, and that's been an entrenched and an ongoing historical issue, which is improving, but there is still an issue with under-recording all domestic abuse, be it intimate partner violence or adult family violence. We also know that it is the absolute minority of victims of any type of domestic abuse who actually report to the police. I think the latest crime survey for England and Wales suggests that it's somewhere around 10 to 15% of individuals impacted actually do contact the police, and there are any number of reasons why that should be the case. Briefly, an awful lot of individuals who are abused don't self-identify as victims of domestic abuse, and we know that from the research. But as I've said, the research focuses predominantly on cases of intimate partner violence. So I mentioned right at the start of the presentation about these patterns. So again, if you're imagining the escalating pattern that I touched on, where there is a honeymoon period and then the perpetrator typically won't start perpetrating the violence and abuse until he or she feels comfortable enough to kind of begin the abuse. Now, what that honeymoon period does, and there's some fantastic academic literature on this, is it creates an unreality, and that unreality is confusing to survivors, to victims. Typically, victims of all domestic abuse will look for reasons beyond that my partner or my spouse or my son or my daughter is perpetrating domestic abuse. What survivors will kind of reflect on is, well, it's the stress, it's the alcohol misuse, it's the mental health issues, it's just their character. Typically, survivors will look for all kinds of explanations as to why they are experiencing the things they are. before they will settle on, well, this must be domestic abuse. And just to illustrate that, we have two refuges in Cambridge that I used to commission. I used to do an awful lot of work with, and we would have many of the women turn up at the refuge who'd been moved there by the police or by social care, and they'd say, I don't know why I'm here. I'm not a victim of domestic abuse. And it's not until there's an intervention, be it a one-to-one intervention with specialist workers or attendance at a freedom program or whatever it is, before these individuals will self-identify as victims. And it's also interesting to note post-intervention how the language used by these survivors changes. They suddenly start talking about risk and coercive control, and phrases that we're familiar with in practice but haven't kind of percolated down, if you like, to the general population. So it's not just practitioners who struggle with conceptualization, it is those who are directly impacted by it. That honeymoon period creates the unreality. I love this person loves me. Why is he or she behaving in this manner? Now, that creates problems in terms of disclosing intimate partner violence. I just want you to reflect on what kind of problems that causes when the perpetrator is a family member, whether it's a son or a daughter, or it's an older parent perpetrating against an older child. Family dynamics, for the majority of us, I hope, are such that the family is a place of safety, and when you've brought somebody up from a baby and you've done the nappies and all the rest of it, that honeymoon period, that forming period, if you like, is prolonged. It may be 15, 16, 20, it may be 40 years of that familial relationship before any violence or abuse presents itself. So if you can kind of imagine how confusing it is for an intimate partner violence to get their head around the fact they are being victimized, imagine how difficult it is for a family member to realize they're victims of domestic abuse. As I've said, the stereotype is, our default is that domestic abuse is about a man going and violently abusing a woman going but as we'll see in a wee while, there is an awful lot of domestic abuse that we know about that doesn't fit that paradigm. It has implications for us as practitioners because we can't rely on survivors, on victims, to make a full and formal disclosure. In my experience, it's the absolute minority of survivors of all types of domestic abuse who have come to me in the past and said, Simon, I'm a victim of domestic abuse. That just doesn't happen. The disclosure or the realization comes through one-to-one work, it comes through discussions, it comes through assessment. And we'll look at a number of tools towards the end of today's session that you can use with survivors in terms of facilitating that disclosure or undertaking a more robust assessment of need, if you like. So I've mentioned the issues with disclosing and reporting to the constabulary and the percentages who do or do not. The crime survey for England and Wales, most the developed nations will have a national crime survey of some type. Paints a different picture. So the prevalence of domestic abuse, according to agencies, is horrific, and there is plenty of it out there, and it keeps us all busy. We see an awful lot of it coming through the front door. But if you reflect on agency data and then look at a crime survey, we're looking at a whole different kettle of fish. The crime survey tells us that domestic abuse of all kinds is far more prevalent than agency data would suggest. Now, that disparity between the two data sets reflects what I've just been saying about formal disclosures. What the crime survey also captures, according to academic research, is the much broader spectrum of domestic abuse. So if you reflect on the definition, the cross-governmental definition we looked at earlier on, that's quite a broad church. That includes intimate partner violence, it includes adult family violence, it's got one-off incidents, and it's got patterns. What we know from the research is typically those individuals who are disclosing to agencies or to the police are victims of quite severe emotional abuse or violent incidents. What the crime survey captures is the entirety of that definition. So it captures the things that Evan Stark, who developed the idea of coercive control called fights. So I've known Evan for quite a few years, and we've talked about this issue of situational violence, episodic violence, which Johnson calls situational. And I was talking to this with Evan, and I said, well, what do you think? What do you think about Johnson's theory on situational violence? And Evan turned to me and said, what, you mean fights? And I was like, okay, yeah, fights. So the crime survey, we think, also captures those experiences which most of us experience in our familial or intimate relationships, where we're not getting on, where we can be a bit loud, we can be a bit shouty, and we can be a bit sweary. So by the methodology of the crime survey for England and Wales, what we're saying is a much higher prevalence of all types of domestic abuse than we're aware of coming through agency data. The other thing I'd like to say about agency data is I've mentioned issues with police recording. Now, it came as a surprise to me as a practitioner in children's services that we weren't able to record domestic abuse in a meaningful way on the various case management systems that we used. Now, it may be different in terms of the provision in Lambeth, but certainly in Cambridgeshire, for example, children's social care will use primary SIN codes, so child in need codes of abuse or neglect. Now, again, that's fine, but what social workers typically don't do, and I'm aware that this just isn't an issue for Cambridgeshire, this is across the board, is they don't use the secondary SIN codes, which would include mental health, substance misuse, domestic abuse, etc., etc., etc. So that's children's social care. Adult social care in Cambridgeshire, up until very recently, couldn't record domestic abuse in a way that we could run MI, we could interrogate the data, etc., etc. That has changed recently, but what that means is we've only started counting over the last couple of years. So those are kind of the high-end provision, social care provision. If you look at more universal provision and their case management systems and recording systems, the norm is that these agencies aren't able to record domestic abuse, or if they are able to record domestic abuse, it's hidden away under some alert, and it's not something that we can interrogate through management information. I'm not pointing fingers here. This is just a thing, and again, it's recognised in practice-based research as well as the academic research. The bottom line is we really don't know. We just know there's a lot of it. If we looked on a global scale, the World Health Organization back in 2013 did some population estimates across the world, and what they found was that their data correlated with national data in terms of prevalence, and typically it's 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 women especially will be victims of domestic abuse of all kinds across their life course. That correlates, as I've said, with what we're seeing in the UK, the US, Australia, and across the European Union generally. There's some really good research done by the FRA across the European Union, looking at the prevalence of domestic abuse and sexual violence in each of the European Union countries, and again, that data tends to correlate with the global and the regional and the national. So we're looking at between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 women across their life course, and between 1 in 6 and 1 in 8 men across their life course. So just moving on to the crime survey for England and Wales estimates. In 2018, 2019, we're always a year behind in terms of interrogating that data. The crime survey suggests that 2% of adults aged 16 to 74 were victims of adult family violence. Again, there are issues around disclosure, there are issues around methodology. For example, the crime survey, there are 2 methods by which they collect their data. One is a questionnaire that drops through your letterbox. The other is you're stopped in the street and canvassed for your responses to various questions. Now, both of those methods there are issues with. In terms of being canvassed in the street, we all know how keen we are on being stopped and spoken to by complete strangers. How likely it is that we would disclose violence or abuse to those canvassers. I don't know. I'll leave that to your own imagination. The second method, which is the survey, which arrives through the letterbox. Again, if you're in a position where you've self-identified as a victim, you're able to reflect on your experiences and you're in a safe enough place to be able to kind of discuss your experiences via that survey form, then great. What I would suggest is the vast majority of individuals are not prepared to discuss their experiences in the street and are not really in a position to reflect in a written format on their experiences via that crime survey form. So again, it just reiterates the point that I'm making. There is more domestic abuse of all types out there than we are familiar with, but it's on that spectrum, it's on that continuum. Some of it will be lower end, and this isn't to minimize, it's not to deny the impact. Some of it is at the lower end, some of it is at the higher end, culminating in the increase in domestic homicides that we're seeing at the current time. And we'll talk more about domestic homicides in a wee while. The last bullet point I draw your attention to here, again, these are estimates, and you'll see my name flagged there, 2015 and 2018. I did some analysis of Cambridgeshire Constabulary data to look at the prevalence of adult family violence. And what I found was there was a significant percentage, and I'll be specific on the next slide, there's a significant percentage of reported domestic abuse is adult family violence. Whether or not we're able to respond appropriately to those disclosures is another matter, and I'll come back to that also in a wee while. Just keep an eye on the time here. Yep, we're fine. Okay, so moving on in terms of the prevalence of adult family violence, as I've said, the higher end of that continuum, that spectrum, that sliding scale, if you like, is homicides. Now, I'm touching wood. The vast majority of domestic abuse does not conclude with a homicide. Unfortunately, what we've seen recently is an increase in domestic homicides. Now, some of that is, you'll have all have seen the headlines around increases in knife crime, especially in London. If you interrogate who the perpetrators and who the victims are of that knife crime, then yes, of course, we have a significant percentage of gang members and younger people especially kind of underpinning that increase. But we've also seen an increase in domestic homicides over that same period. Now, I would like to say it's all down to COVID, it's all down to lockdown, it's all about proximity, but we saw that increase in knife crime before we entered the pandemic. Now, in terms of the drivers for that increase, again, you'll have read the news reports, you'll have seen the stories on TV. For me, the increase in knife crime and the increase in domestic homicides is due to an increase in strain. Now, I'll get all academic on you for a wee while. The general strain theory has it that the more strains and stresses that individuals are under, the more likelihood they are to respond with violence or abuse. The academic who developed this is a guy called Agnew. It's self-evident to me. A lot of the best academic research is, as I said, is self-evident. It resonates. It makes sense. And what Agnew argues, as I've said, is where there are more stresses and more strains, we see more violence, more abuse, and poorer outcomes. Now, without getting too political, I think we can all acknowledge over the last decade, we have seen an increase in stresses and strains. We've seen a decrease in resources across the board for local authorities and third sector and police and criminal justice agencies, etc., etc. We've seen increases in unemployment. We've seen issues with changes to benefits. We've seen pressures brought on around housing and accessing housing and shortages. All of these stresses and strains which have kind of developed for one reason or another, and again, I'm not going to point fingers, but have developed for one reason or another over the last decade. It's not surprising to me that we've seen an increase in violent crime, we've seen an increase in knife crime, and we've seen an increase in domestic homicide. Those cuts to provision and to services and to local authority and to criminal justice agencies have a direct knock-on effect with victims and survivors in terms of what we can offer and how we respond. And those issues create additional levels of stresses and strains. So I mentioned in the previous slides issues with disclosing domestic abuse. When victims and survivors, all victims and survivors, make the decision to disclose, it's made on a cost-benefit analysis. So what do I get? What are the benefits of disclosing or reporting this, and what are the disbenefits? What are the issues? What are the risks? And I'd encourage you, perhaps not now, but when you're thinking about the session later, to just do that cost-benefit analysis yourself. Try and empathise. Try and put yourself in the position of a survivor of adult family violence. What does it benefit me to make this disclosure, and what does it cost me? In an intimate relationship, you could lose you lose your partner, you could lose your children, you could lose your accommodation, etc., etc. Within adult family violence, that dynamic, you're losing your family, you're losing your son, you're losing your daughter, or another close relation. I'm just reflecting now on the Nasty Nick and Dot Cotton slide that I showed you earlier. That was a very protracted period of time that the abuse and violence took place over, and time again, Dot would let Nick back into her life. Now, some of that was coerced. Some of it was Nick lying and conniving and trying to kind of get his way with Dot, usually to abuse her economically or whatever, but some of it was kind of the natural response of a mother to her perception of her child in need. So of course you would let individuals like Nick back into your life because they're your children. That's a lifelong relationship. That relationship doesn't go away. And it was brought home to me how difficult it is to terminate an adult family violence type relationship. When I was reading through some research that one of my PhD students, I'll come on to in a wee while, was undertaking with survivors of adult family violence. And it was very profound. One of the mothers she was interviewing, the only way she could cope with her experiences is to pretend or convince herself that her son had died. He is dead to me, he's gone. I can't think about him as a living entity because it hurts too much. And I thought that was really profound and really kind of impactful in terms of that cost-benefit analysis. And I'm not saying that survivors go through that formal process, but imagine the kind of internal conversations and debates that mother must have had to settle on, well, I have to pretend my child is dead. Incredibly powerful, incredibly difficult to kind of conceptualize or empathize with. I'm thinking of my two boys, one's in primary school, one's in secondary school. I can't imagine a time that they haven't been here, and I can't imagine a time in the future that they won't be here, but who knows. So anyway, going back to the homicides, Sharp, Jeffs and Kelly, here's Liz Kelly again, in 2016. I don't know how many of you are familiar, but the Home Office produced an analysis of domestic homicides in 2016 on a national basis across England and Wales, and the organisation Standing Together produced an analysis for the London area, the Moorpark area, which was written by Sharp, Jeffs and Kelly. And of the 30 homicides that Sharp, Jeffs and Kelly reviewed, 74% fit that kind of historical paradigm, that dynamic of intimate partner violence, and it's predominantly the male perpetrating the homicide against the female victim. But you'll note from that little kind of infographic there that 26% of the homicides that were reviewed in the London area for that time were adult family violence, or as Sharp, Jeffs and Kelly call it, family-related homicide. The majority, unsurprisingly, of those cases were matricide. So mum was killed almost exclusively by an adult male child. Patricide, there were 2 cases of patricide, so that's the killing of a father, again predominantly by male perpetrators, and then fratricide is the killing of a brother or a sister, depending, and there was 1 case of that, and again it was a male perpetrator. What the national research for the Home Office found, which is the second bullet point here on homicides, is that the highest proportion of victims were aged 30 to 50, which is why I raised the point earlier that the term elder abuse isn't satisfactory, especially when we're looking at homicide. Now, there are some specific issues that older people face in terms of conceptualizing and self-identifying and asking for help, some of which are structural, some of which are around societal norms, some of which is around awareness. So we know older people are less likely to self-identify, they're less likely to come forward because some of the social structures which underpin violence and abuse were norms then and aren't now. Things are improving in terms of our familial and intimate relationships and how we relate to each other, and a lot of the behaviours which we now look back on as being misogynistic or abusive or violent or whatever were perfectly acceptable then. So there's an issue there around conceptualization generally, but in terms of homicide, so the numbers of dead people that we are responding to, the majority are aged 30 to 50. Unsurprisingly, the vast majority, well, or not as the case may be, the vast majority of perpetrators of all homicides are male. We also need to interrogate the 13% of homicides who are perpetrated by females and try and understand the dynamics involved in those homicides, because again we default to, well, it's a female perpetrator, it must be a male victim. That's not necessarily the case. We see a significant prevalence of same-sex homicides, homosexual relationships, etc., etc. But what we also see is adult female children perpetrating homicide against their parents and carers as well. So it's not, again, not to deny that women are perfectly capable of perpetrating homicide, are perfectly capable of using violence and abuse in their familial and their intimate relationships, but the facts don't lie that the vast majority of perpetrators across the board are typically male, and typically males with kind of associated issues, additional issues. So the two I've highlighted here are substance misuse and mental health issues. Time and time again, we see these as aggravating factors. They're not causality. I'm hoping you're all aware that it's not the stellar, it's not the stress, it's not the mental health which causes the violence and abuse. They are triggers for that. Alcohol and substance misuse are disinhibitors and also triggers for other mental health issues. So where we see those intersections of maleness, masculinity, substance misuse, and mental health issues, if we saw those intersections in an intimate relationship, we might hear alarm bells ringing in terms of the potential of what might happen. When we see those intersections in adult family relationships, we tend not to reach the same conclusions. We tend generally to minimize the risk that those intersections present. I can tell you through my experience of quality assessing homicide reviews and undertaking homicide reviews that is a mistake. Where we see those intersections in terms of the perpetration or the suspected perpetration of violence or abuse, we have to take those in the broader context of all domestic homicides. And then you'll see on the last bullet point here, in terms of police reported incidents, in Cambridgeshire at least, and I undertook 2 separate pieces of research to understand the prevalence of adult family violence. What I found was between 17 and 29% of all reported DA was adult family violence. And just to put that into context, I think in 2018, when I was looking at all domestic abuse incidents, Cambridgeshire had around 15,000 incidents of domestic abuse. So the point here is, this is not an insignificant volume of survivors disclosing their experience to the police. It's in the thousands. And if we bear in mind the percentage of individuals overall who do report to the police is incredibly low, what I take from this data is there are thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of cases of adult family violence which do not come to the attention of the police. Now that raises questions for all of us as practitioners in terms of, well, what do we do with these cases. What do we do with these families? How do we best respond? And we'll come to that in a wee while. So just checking the clock, we have 10 minutes until the break. So I'm just going to move on to the next couple of slides here. We are doing well for time. So the impact of adult family violence, we don't know. As Bose and Perlin have argued, it's difficult to measure because the research hasn't been done. So I leave some of this to your imagination. I think the point I am trying to get across is there are an awful lot of similarities between adult family violence and intimate partner violence. Therefore, we should expect the impacts to be very similar. Now, there are differences because of the way family dynamics work and protective factors and risk factors. And also issues around proximity. So again, I don't know what you're thinking in terms of adult family violence. Are you thinking of a cohesive family all in one house at the same time over the lockdown period? Not necessarily the case. We know in intimate partner violence, for example, we see spikes in police reporting around Christmas and the summer holidays, and you'll see that reflected in the media. Oh, there's an increase on weekends, or there's an increase in the summer holidays. There isn't an increase, it's always there. What we're seeing is people are more likely to disclose because of issues of proximity, so the neighbours are at home, etc., etc., etc. I don't want you to go away from today's session thinking that the dynamics of family violence are such that the adult child always has to be in the family home. Often that's not the case. They've moved out. They've kind of gone their own way. They're renting. They've bought, etc., etc. So that issue of proximity is somewhat different to the dynamic we see in intimate partner violence. Now, I've mentioned COVID and I've mentioned lockdown. It troubles me. It grieves me to think of. Again, you'll have seen the headlines in the media: free rail travel for women escaping domestic violence, additional resource going to specialist services such as Women's Aid and Refuge, etc., etc., etc. Where is the enhanced response over the COVID lockdown to adult family violence? Why are we not seeing additional provision being made for those who are escaping violence perpetrated by their family members? Why isn't there the same awareness raising going on? Why not the same response? So as I've said, it's difficult to measure because the research hasn't been done. But what we do know in terms of intimate partner violence is reflected in the model that I presented here, which is from the World Health Organization in 2013. And the reason I like this model, and I'm happy to apply it with some addendums to adult family violence, is it puts physical trauma, psychological trauma, and stress and fear and control on the same weighting. Again, historically, stereotypically, we tend to think of stabbings and strangulation and punching and all those nasty things as being somehow worse than psychological trauma or fear and control of the impact of coercive control. What we actually know from survivors is that's not the case. Those three factors are equal, or my personal opinion, my personal experience is that the psychological trauma and the fear and control are actually more difficult to address than the physical trauma. So a colleague at Addenbrooke's Hospital, one of the biggest hospitals in the country, Dr. Adrian Boyle, we have had many conversations over the years about kind of the physical injuries, as said, strangulation, stabbings and all the rest of it. And he tells me those things heal, those things go away. The psychological issues that arise from that, or the fear of the perpetration starting again, those things never go away. And the best analogy I've come up with when I've been training practitioners with regards to the fear of perpetration returning is cancer, and breast cancer more specifically, because the vast majority of people I've trained happen to be women. You can go into remission, you can be treated, the physical cancer can go away, but the fear of that cancer coming back and the trauma that you experienced as a result of the fear that you had when the cancer was actually live and living within you, that's much more profound and much more difficult to address. So what we see, if we follow that model down, we see mental health problems, PTSD, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, suicidality, etc., etc. Moving over to healthcare seeking, a lack of autonomy, difficulty seeking care and other services. We move down onto kind of specific health issues, so irritable bowel, chronic pain, chronic pelvic pain, cardiovascular diseases, hypertension. These real, literally medical issues that result directly from violence and abuse. Again, we tend to minimize these and we tend to ignore them. So if you are working with a family where these health issues are prevalent, there are mental health issues, there are physical incarnations of violence and abuse. Those should be risk factors that we're responding to, we're identifying and responding to. And then finally, for this slide, what research we do have comes from the lovely Amanda Holt again and Vargin in 2013. And this research suggests and supports the point that I'm making here, that the impact or the outcomes, if you like, are, yes, they can be physical, but are also emotional and financial. Now, there is a growing awareness around financial abuse, but again, it's typically focusing on intimate partner violence. Imagine, if you will, the dynamics and the impact of financial abuse within a family dynamic. Now, you're all familiar with the term or the phrase, the bank of mum and dad. Well, that's a light-hearted kind of reflection on the fact that your kids might leave home, but they're always going to be financially dependent on you in some way or other. Now, try and empathize, try and imagine the dynamic where that financial abuse is just that. It's not part of a kind of nurturing and developmental dynamic designed to set your kids up for life. You are being extorted, you're being financially abused, it's ruining your finances, it's putting you into rent arrears, etc., etc., etc. So anyway, just to conclude on this element, the impacts of adult family violence, as far as I'm concerned, in my professional opinion, are exactly the same, with a few variations. Obviously, the sexual and reproductive health is not as relevant as it would be to intimate partner violence, but certainly as far as I'm concerned, and the research backs this up, the impact of adult family violence should be considered as the same as intimate partner violence. So again, I'm reflecting on my prior training as a practitioner, and 25 years ago when I was receiving training about domestic abuse, it was from a feminist perspective, which again is absolutely fine, absolutely fantastic. It meets the need for a significant cohort of those affected by violence and abuse. And the predominant theory in terms of how we've been trained historically and currently actually is that domestic abuse is a means of social control. So Dorbash and Dorbash started writing about this issue of the battered wife back in the 70s actually, and their theory is it's a result of the patriarchy. It's a result of our social structures which stress the primacy of the male, and there are many examples of this in terms of our judiciary, our monarchy, our laws, our sports, our cultural and entertainment, kind of anything we look at, we can kind of unpick and say, okay, dominated by the primacy of the male. Things are changing. I would like to see things change much more quickly, but certainly Dorbash and Dorbash, and if you looked at the likes of Evan Stark and Professor Liz Kelly, etc., they all come from that feminist perspective. And as a theoretical framework, most of my work, because I mentioned right at the start, is around gender-based violence. As a theoretical framework, I buy into this idea of the patriarchy. As I've said, there are subcultures, there are variations, but for me personally, I don't think we can deny that we live in a male-dominated world, and that men feel entitled to use violence and abuse to maintain their primacy. So the majority of the resources available to us, the majority of the interventions, even the DASH I mentioned, the Domestic Abuse, Stalking and Harassment Risk Indicator Checklist, is based on feminist principles that domestic abuse, intimate partner violence is a means of social control. It's to protect the primacy of the male. The next theory we come on to, which is from Anderson Umberson in 2001, is related to that. So there is a discrete difference between Dorbash and Dorbash saying it's a means of social control, and Anderson and Umberson saying it's around threatened masculinity. And I've touched on this briefly, but I'll reiterate. So Anderson and Umberson believe, as we move towards more gender inequality, what we see is a threat to masculinity. Anderson and Umberson talk about men being emasculated, so having our dangly bits cut off, not literally, as kind of the genders, however many we are counting these days, as the genders move towards more equality, this threat to masculinity makes us respond more violently and with more abuse to maintain our position. So there is a discrete difference to Dorbash and Dorbash's theory, but it's kind of tied into this idea around the primacy of the male, which is grand. Again, I've given you the prevalence of domestic abuse. We've looked at the statistics. We've seen the vast majority of all types of domestic abuse are perpetrated by men, both on a national and a global level. So those theories tend to fit. But what about those situations, those contexts where patriarchy and power and control isn't a factor? What about the adult female daughter perpetrating against a mother? What about same-sex relationships? What about female perpetrators? How does that fit within kind of the paradigm of patriarchal power and control? Well, for me, it doesn't. And rather than trying to fit square pegs into round holes, I think it's more appropriate for us to be looking at other theories that have been somewhat sidelined in terms of workforce development and awareness raising, but seem to be more helpful in terms of conceptualizing the causes of domestic abuse and kind of moving away from a big picture into individual contexts and dynamics. So Strauss and Gellis, American academics, they're psychologists. So naturally, they would come at this from a perspective of, well, it's about stresses and strains. So I've mentioned arguing, I've mentioned general strain theory. I think as a kind of a common sense approach in terms of theories, which we can all relate to, I think a negative response to stresses and strains is something we can all empathize with. We're all impacted by negative experiences. Now, Strauss and Gellis talk about the normative acceptability of violence. There's that word normative again. So Strauss and Gellis are certainly not feminists, and they've written at some length about how they disagree with feminist theory, etc., etc. But that word normative acceptability of violence, Liz Kelly, when she was talking about sexual violence and writing about sexual violence in the 1980s, she talked about sexual violence being normative and functional. Normative because not everybody's at it, but it's a normal part of everyday life, and functional because it serves a purpose. Now, what Strauss and Gellis are saying here is we all accept violence to a degree. We are all, and one of my favorite words at the minute is titillated. We're all titillated by violence. We buy into violence. We enjoy violence. Stereotypically, and that's reflected in the kind of TV we watch, the movies we watch, the sports we watch, etc., etc. It doesn't even matter if you're watching the David Attenborough documentary on TV on a Sunday night. We'll see lions ripping something to shreds, blah 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 blah. It's in the name of entertainment. Violence is a normative part of our society, so it shouldn't surprise us when individuals respond violently to stresses and strains. And then the last bit of Strauss and Gellis's theory, this inability to express feelings appropriately, that's tied into a lack of emotional intelligence and the ability to communicate effectively. And again, this resonates with me as a man. I'm sure you're aware that, again, stereotypically and generalizing here, but men arguably struggle more than women to communicate their emotions and their feelings. To kind of reference that, I would cite the suicide rates among men are much higher than among women. When you look at the academic literature, those suicides are prompted by the inability for men to relate their experiences and their emotions. They bottle it up, and it doesn't end well. But we all have, at various points in our lives and with various individuals, we all have issues with the ability to express our feelings appropriately. And by appropriately, I mean not effing and blinding, as I am sometimes want to do. It's how do we develop as humans and individuals? How do we develop new ways of communicating that aren't limited to posts on social media or tweets? How do we engage in a meaningful conversation which can offset the risk of violence or abuse from occurring? Moving on to the second last bullet point there, which is Sheff, who's another psychologist, right, in 1997, linked to Strauss and Gellis's theories. Sheff argues that domestic abuse of all types can be prompted by what are called shame and rage cycles. A shame rage cycle is, I've done something bad, I feel bad about it, you tell me off or you challenge my behavior. I can't process that because I don't have the emotional intelligence to do that. I don't have the drivers or the will or the motivation to change that. Therefore, I respond to your challenge violently or with abuse. And what we ended up is with these dysfunctional communication patterns, and which lead to unacknowledged shame, creating a repetitive cycle of insult and revenge. And again, this is to go back to Marianne's question about kind of situational versus this broader pattern of coercive control. I'm sure, I hope we can all kind of empathize with these types of relationships or these types of episodes where we have this repetitive cycle of insult and revenge. I haven't addressed my feelings. I have unmet needs. I have unmet wants, and I can't really express them in an appropriate and functional way. So I will use violence and abuse, verbal or physical, to kind of get that point across. And then what we see is the victim or the survivor of that rage cycle, if you like, responds themselves with rage or with violence or abuse, and that would be more kind of situational than it would be patternized. And then finally, we've got Amanda Holt again, based on her research with older people. She agrees with Liz Kelly and with Dobash and Anderson Umberson that we're talking about continuums of violence. I was talking about this scale of violence that we're all situated on. We like to think we're not, but we are if we self-interrogate. And overlaid over these continuums of violence, we have this issue with intergenerational conflict. Now, I brought this issue of intergenerational conflict up at a recent event I was doing for our local education child protection service, and it did not go down well. I should have chosen my audience with a bit more care. So I was talking to educators and teachers who love kids and who are spending their professional careers working with kids. And I go in there and I start saying, well, actually, older people don't like younger people don't like older people, and there is this intergenerational conflict. And I got, I wouldn't say I got booed, but I had a few eyebrows raised. The point I'm trying to make, or the point Amanda's trying to make here in terms of intergenerational conflict, and we can see it at the current time in our media headlines. The resurgence of COVID, according to the media, is being blamed on young people going to Ibiza and going to parties and going to raves and all the rest of it. Older people, we know, are not particularly well valued in our society generally. We tend to pack them off to care homes and treat them not as well as we should, perhaps, or not as well as other societies do. And the academic literature reflects that. There was I use a lovely slide from Plato, the Greek philosopher, when he's talking about young people back in ancient Greece, and he's saying they've got no respect for their elders, they don't listen at school, they're messy eaters, they don't look after the clothes, they're basically just horrible. So in terms of the intergenerational conflict theory, it was ever thus. Or some of us have unresolved issues from childhood. We resent our parents. We've had bubbles burst in terms of, and again, I don't know whether this speaks to you, but kind of the realization that our elders are not necessarily our betters, and our parents are as fallible as we are, and are not. We tend to put parents on a pedestal and grandparents on a pedestal, and we idolize them and lionize them, and actually it comes as quite a shock Speaking from personal experience, when you get to that age in life where you actually realise your parents are they're as fallible and as prone to mistakes as you are. So all of these theories, there are others. The academic literature is vast on this. So what I'm relaying here are kind of the predominant academic theories, which unfortunately, from my perspective anyway, do not percolate down or are not disseminated down in terms of workforce development. And I was asked when I presented something similar to this workshop, this masterclass last year, why have you included the theories? Isn't that just confusing because we all know it's about power and control? Well, I am just one voice, but my voice is informed by years of practice, years of academic research, and kind of a pragmatic response to the need presenting. And I am as convinced as I ever have been about anything that there is more than one explanation in terms of the theory behind domestic abuse. And I think the more we understand and the more we can be empathetic in terms of causality, the better responses we can develop. Okay, so that was about 3 years worth of theoretical study on one slide. Let's move on to risk factors. And this is the part of the presentation where I'm kind of wanting you to consider what is the same and what is the different, what is the same and what is different between adult family violence and intimate partner violence. For me, and I don't want to spoil the fun or the surprise, if you like, there are far more similarities than there are differences. I've used a range of academic and practice-based sources and citations here to kind of give you an holistic picture in terms of the risk factors. Now, the health warning for this next section, if you like, and I've talked about the DASH, the Domestic Abuse Daughter Risk Assessment Checklist, several times previously. In terms of assessing risk of adult family violence, that risk assessment is perhaps not the most appropriate to use. Now, I know that may create problems in terms of it's the common risk assessment, and we're encouraged to use it. The background to the DASH is this. It was developed on the back of 30 intimate partner violence homicides, where all of the victims were female and they all had children. So the risk assessment is weighted towards the risk to females with children. Now, again, I'm not here to criticize the DASH. It is significantly better than what it replaced, which was called SPECS, which was a far more criminal justice focused risk assessment, but it's perhaps not the most appropriate tool to use in cases of adult family violence. It is much better than its predecessor. It has focused the mind of lots of practitioners in terms of thinking about risk and what types of risk are out there. The key bit of the DASH in terms of assessing risk for adult family violence is the professional judgment element on the front. The questions, the 25 questions or the 28, depending on which version you're using, are weighted towards IPV with a female victim. You use the DASH, you use that professional judgment element on the front page to get to codify and relate the risks associated with AFV if you're using the DASH as a referral process to MARAC or whatever. So having said that, we'll come back onto how you can assess and build in an assessment of risk into an assessment in a wee while. But the risk factors that you're looking for are age. So I've mentioned the demographic in terms of homicide being between kind of 30 and 50 odd. We know from the crime survey for England and Wales that younger people, so those aged 16 to 25, and older people, those aged 55 and above, are far more likely to be victims of all types of domestic abuse, not resulting in a homicide. So in terms of adult family violence, the likelihood is that the cohort that you should be most focused on or be most concerned about is those aged 50, 55 and above. The research, which is practice-based in this case, but I could have cited academic references, also shows that certain ethnic groups are more at risk than others. Now, I'm not going, again, it would be unfair of me to single out particular ethnic groups, but I'm sure we're all aware that there are certain factors attached to ethnicity or ethnic groups which can increase the likelihood of adult family violence. Now, I'll give you an example from my own life. So my mum's family are all Irish Catholics, and I was brought up in a Catholic environment. I went to Catholic schools and all the rest of it. Massive families. So my auntie, one of my uncle's aunties has 7 children. Another one has 8. Big families in close proximity, spending a lot of time together. That could be conceived as a risk factor with regards to adult family violence. When I first moved to Cambridgeshire 20 odd years ago, the single biggest ethnic group, aside from white UK, were Gypsies, Travellers and Roma. Again, there are discrete risk factors associated with belonging to that ethnic group. In terms of gender, it shouldn't really come as any great surprise that if you are female or identify as female, then you're more at risk of all types of domestic abuse, including adult family violence. And the relationship type. Now, this is quite a strange one, because we're talking about intimate relationships or family relationships. So what do we mean by that? Well, what Sharp, Jeff Kelly and Burgett et al. Say about the relationship type kind of links back to some of the theories that we were looking at in the previous slide. If you have a functional relationship, if you have a healthy relationship, then you are less likely to perpetrate or be victimized through adult family violence or any other type of domestic abuse. If you have a nurturing and loving relationship, those in themselves are protective factors. If you have a relationship with a professional, a functional relationship with a professional, that in itself is a protective factor. Adversely, or on the contrary, if your relationship type is dysfunctional, there's low emotional intelligence, there are poor communication pathways, that is a risk factor. We know that there is an intersection between disabilities and illnesses and the victimization through domestic abuse. Just as we know, for example, in terms of intimate partner violence, there is a correlation between pregnancy and the perpetration of violence and abuse. This risk factor is around additional vulnerabilities, whatever they may be. You are more vulnerable in general society if you have a disability or an illness than you are if you don't. And if you are within a relationship, a familial or an intimate relationship where there is the potential for violence and abuse to occur, those intersections again should be considered as a risk. Now, the last bullet point on this slide is around dependence, isolation and instability, and we are all, I think, familiar with familial relationships where there is an overdependence, where isolation is problematic. And I'm thinking now in terms of hoarding and the risks that those can bring. Also rural isolation and urban isolation as well. I mean, we tend to think of isolation geographically in terms of being stuck in the middle of the fens, and God knows that is a risk factor in Cambridgeshire. But for me, isolation can happen in a tower block. It doesn't matter whether it's Tower Hamlets or a fen drove in Cambridgeshire. That is an identifiable discrete risk factor. And here we see instability again. Well, that instability in terms of how your relationship functions relates back to the theories we were looking at previously. It also, all of these in terms of, well, dependence and instability especially, I'd encourage you as practitioners to think about finances and accommodation. We know there are correlates between insecure finances and insecure accommodation status. Why? Because they create stresses and strains. Again, we're not excusing the perpetration of a violence, we're trying to understand what the triggers are. And if you are on a 0 hours contract, or you're on furlough, or you've just been made redundant, and you're just about to lose your tenancy because we're just about to start letting landlords kick out tenants at the current time, those are stresses and strains which can constitute risk factors. So when you are assessing, or when you're screening, or when you're thinking about risk, consider those broader contexts. What is going on in the lives of these individuals? I can tell you from experience that I would say it's a significant, if not the vast majority of homicide reviews that I either quality assessed or have been involved in authoring. Finances and income is always a significant factor or a trigger. Because it typically creates the greatest strain. There may be underlying patriarchal beliefs, there may be underlying unresolved issues, intergenerational issues, all the rest of that, but they're brought to a head by issues of dependence and instability, both in employment, in education, and certainly in terms of finances. So, moving along to additional risk factors associated with adult family violence. Now, we'll see in a wee while when we look at the typology of perpetrators that there are identifiable types. There are different types of perpetrators. But what we do know is where individuals have perpetrated any type of criminal activity or any type of violence historically, that is a significant risk factor. It is highly unusual for a perpetrator of homicide, but of serious domestic abuse to have no prior history of violence or criminality. We'll talk about that in depth in the next slide, I think. But it's certainly something to bear in mind. Just because an individual has no history or no known history of the perpetration of domestic abuse does not mean they're not capable of it. Again, when I reflect on training I received 25 years ago, I was told that domestic abuse perpetrators were cowards. They would only perpetrate in the confines of their family environment or with their intimate partner, and outwardly they would appear perfectly normal. Well, that does happen, but equally, or more than equally, I would say we see an awful lot of DA perpetrated by what we would call general criminals or those with general criminal tendencies. Substance misuse, we've touched on. It's not a cause in the vast majority of cases. It is a trigger, it's a disinhibitor, and it's indicative of all kinds of other issues. Again, if we reflect on the theories that I presented earlier, why do people get involved in substance misuse? It's typically as an escape from something. What are individuals trying to escape from? Well, it's unmet need, it's unresolved issues, it's issues arising from childhood. All of those things can exacerbate the problems with substance misuse as a resolution, as a help-seeking kind of approach to unresolved issues. Mental health, again, poor mental health is a risk factor in terms of victimization and perpetration. We don't have time to go into individual psychologies and pathologies today. There are certain aspects of mental health, so I've talked about those with narcissistic tendencies or borderline personality disorders. There's some really strong research linking borderline personality disorders, especially with the perpetration of domestic abuse. And then kind of one of the key elements I've been talking about today, and it's not just me that think our risk assessment tools and processes aren't particularly fit for purpose in terms of addressing adult family violence. The Home Office have made comment on this. Sharp, Jeffson, Kelly and HMIC FRS have all flagged the limitations of our current tools and processes. So I don't know how many of you are sitting out there expecting me to hand you a toolkit and a new risk assessment model at the end of this. Unfortunately, and I don't want to disappoint you, that's not going to happen. What we've got at the current time is as good as we're going to get till somebody comes up with something better. But it's enough for you to know that there are limitations and that the processes and tools we currently have in our armory are not designed exclusively or explicitly to address adult family violence. A not unrelated issue is low awareness, which I'm trying to address desperately with you today. Most individuals, and again, this is it's not a finger pointing exercise. It's a consequence of awareness campaigns and kind of how we've conceptualized domestic abuse, and also the influence of feminist activists on the agenda overall. We wouldn't have refuges, we wouldn't have national strategies, we wouldn't have risk assessment tools, we wouldn't have interventions without the work of feminist activists. So I'm not poo-pooing our risk assessment tools and processes. What I'm saying is they are fit for a certain purpose. I understand the etiology, I understand the background of those processes and tools. What I'm seeing is my challenge is now that we need a more targeted, we need a more responsive approach to the issue of adult family violence. The issue with low awareness links into some of the questions that were raised via the live chat. How do we get the awareness out there? For me, I've already put my cards on the table. It's around Nasty Nick and Doc Cotton. The more we can kind of get those conversations happening, the more we can reflect on the fact that adult family violence is not something which happens to other people. It's far more prevalent, it's far more insidious, and it's far more impactful than most people would conceive. I think that is the way we need to increase public awareness. And then we have the last bullet point is from research Standing Together did in 2019, where they looked at some of the very specific elements informing risk, and one which I very much buy into because I've seen it time and time again through homicide abusers' caring responsibilities, and that speaks to me about, again, stresses and strains. Again, the support we provide to carers, or those with carers responsibility with caring responsibility is diminished over the years as resource and funding has. In a lot of cases, we let carers just crack on, whether they're paid or unpaid, and we're not supporting them in terms of the isolation they feel and the stresses and strains and the massive amount of resentment and confusion these individuals can face as primary carers. And certainly the homicide reviews I've been involved with in terms of quality assessing and directly involved in terms of IMRs or panel interventions, those homicides which result as a consequence of the stress and strains brought on from caring responsibilities are by far and away the most tragic that I've had to work around. I'll just give you an example of a DHR that was published that I quality assessed, where it was quite an elderly lady, had been caring for 40 years for her quite profoundly disabled son, and wasn't receiving the help and support that she needed. She became more and more distraught and despondent in terms of the scenario, and she could see her son was going downhill rapidly. She set fire to the house, and her son died of smoke inhalation. The fire service managed to remove her from the property. Yes, it's a domestic homicide. Yes, it's horrible. Yes, it's tragic. Yes, the son is dead. But when we actually interrogate the context and the background to that domestic homicide, it really raises some quite profound questions on how we should respond to that level of need, but also how we conceptualize domestic homicide and domestic abuse. Again, I'd encourage you to reflect on the theories I put forward first. How does that scenario I've just painted for you, how does that reflect the dominant paradigm about power and control and patriarchy? Because for me, it doesn't. What it speaks to me is something which is situational, which is contextual, which really makes me think there, but for the grace of God, if you believe in such an entity. Okay, just checking the time. We are getting along quite nicely. We've got around 24 minutes left to finish up before we move to the plenary and respond to some more questions. So I'm moving on from risk factors now to look at adult family violence, synergies with intimate partner violence perpetrators. So I mentioned previously there are different types of perpetrators. Those perpetrators are motivated in different ways. Now, what I'm presenting here is some quite comprehensive academic research from 2006. This is an American academic's attempt to typologize IPV perpetrators. The reason I'm raising it here is really just to solidify some learning or some thoughts that we have about different typologies of adult family violence perpetrators as well. I have concluded several times that there are different types of perpetrators motivated by different kind of circumstances, some internal, some external. So what Chifriller and all found in their research was, and again, try and relate this to kind of any thoughts you've got about adult family violence perpetrators and how these types might or might not fit. So we've got pathological what Chifriller would call pathological batterers. So those who respond to jealousy with violence, and that jealousy doesn't have to be about, in terms of adult family violence, it doesn't have to be about kind of people getting into new relationships or leaving relationships, any of that kind of stuff. It could be about resource, it could be about income, it could be about jobs, it could be about jealousy about anything. And if you're struggling to conceptualize this, and you've seen the headlines, the individual who we would consider to be a pathological batterer or a pathological perpetrator would be those who are narcissistic, those who adopt the mindset, well, if I can't have you, nobody else can. And typically when we see domestic homicides reported in the newspaper, especially where children have been harmed as a direct consequence, it's usually, well, you've left me, how dare you leave me, I'm going to kill you, or I'm going to kill the kids, or both. Then we move on to, and this next typology is relevant to adult family violence. We haven't really had time today to talk about sexual violence within adult family violence relationships, but it is there. We do see cases of sexual violence and sexual abuse within families. So we see those perpetrators who use, and to quote, I think, Pat Benatar, who use sex as a weapon. Those who use sexual violence as a method of control and conflict resolution. Just as an aside, and it's something worth thinking about, in terms of rape, we've been kind of programmed to think of stranger danger and stranger rape and all the rest of it. The statistics don't lie. The vast majority of sexual violence and rape occurs within an intimate or a family environment. Certainly the vast majority of children and the vast majority of older people are sexually abused by somebody within the household. And we know from the academic literature, Liz Kelly and friends, that sexual violence is an expression of something. It's not about the sexual act. It's not about, excuse the term, but it's not about getting your rocks off. It's nothing to do with that. It's about control. It's about dominance and domination. So this typology is as relevant and as applicable in terms of adult family violence as it would be in an intimate partner relationship. And as a further aside, I'd also like you to think about consent in terms of sexual relationships within an intimate partner violence type relationship. For me, coerced consent is no consent at all. So as far as I'm concerned, anybody who's a victim of intimate partner violence, where there is a sexual element to that relationship, is also a victim of sexual violence. I leave that there with you. That is perhaps for a future masterclass. Then we move on to generally violent batterers or perpetrators. And these are the types of individuals that I was talking about previously, who are, and I try not to swear when I talk about this typology. So I'll use some other, what terminology? Scroats is a word that we used to use in the Northeast. Generally antisocial individuals who use violence and abuse in all social scenarios. They're not limited to violence and abuse in a domestic setting or an intimate setting. It's across the board. Then we have psychologically violent batterers who use emotional and psychological violence as a method of control and conflict resolution. I'm sure you know by now that not all domestic abuse involves a violent incident. So for me, trying to understand the psychologies of men typically who use this form of control, it's coercion. It's trying to get something that you feel as though you're entitled to, which links us back to those theories about patriarchal power and control, entitlement and primacy, etc., etc. And again, not to separate out those theories, but it also links into those who really want to dominate a relationship, feel as though they're entitled, and power imbalances have changed within that relationship. For example, as a child, you are somewhat powerless. Your parents have the power. As you become older into early adulthood and your parents age, God knows, I know, I feel this at the current time, then that power dynamic shifts and your children suddenly become more powerful than the parents, because they have more energy, they have more disposable income, their health is better, etc., etc., etc. So there's something about the power dynamic there which can trigger psychologically violent offenders. And then final bullet point, and again, I remind you, other typologies are available. These are the ones that speak to my experience the most. We have those who, as I mentioned, I was taught about predominantly 25 years ago, that we have these family-only perpetrators who feel inadequate in some way or feel challenged in some way, and who respond violently to this perceived threat, who don't respond well to authority. It links, I think, to the psychologically violent individuals where psychologies, where pathologies are challenged. So imagine a scenario where somebody comes home and they've been out at the pub all night, they get home 3 o'clock in the morning, and mum or dad is giving them a hard time. How dare you? This is my house, etc., etc., etc. That is perceived as a threat. It's perceived as a threat to masculinity. It's perceived as a threat to adulthood. And again, it kind of explains, if you like, why certain individuals would have that propensity, is probably the best word, to perpetrate violence and abuse only within the family environment and not outside of that environment. I hope that makes sense, because that's quite a complex typology to take on board during such a short and remote session. So moving on now to look at some other synergies, and I'm loath to some degree to kind of labour the point about homicides, because mercifully and thankfully the vast majority of all domestic abuse does not culminate in a homicide, but we know more about homicides than we know about most of the types of domestic abuse. So most of the data, most of the research comes to us through kind of research into domestic homicides. And what we see, just in terms of the typologies of perpetrators and just in terms of the risks, is there is I don't know if it's surprising, but there is a marked similarity between IPV and adult family violence. So again, here we see gender. If you are female, you identify as female, you're far more at risk of homicide and domestic abuse across the board. The method of killing, which is not something we like to think about too much, but it's worth raising the point. So the vast majority of homicides in this country are inflicted through either strangulation or stabbing. The only reason for that is we don't have access to guns. If you go to the US or you go to Australia, the vast majority of homicides are perpetrated using a firearm. It's worth bearing in mind in terms of assessing risk, because stabbings are so prevalent because of our access to knives. Every kitchen has a knife in it, etc., etc., etc. I had a wry smile. I think it was Nottinghamshire Constabulary last year. We're actually providing survivors of domestic abuse, typically intimate partner violence, with plastic knives to keep in the kitchen. So if the perpetrator did get in, he or she couldn't stab the victim. The other thing worth bearing in mind in terms of strangulation, and I mentioned Dr. Adrian Boyle at Addenbrooke's Hospital earlier, and I think some of you will be familiar with some of the high-profile media cases where strangulation is used in terms of sexual activity and sexual play, if you like, and it's been used as a defence in terms of a rough sex defence. Well, the issue with strangulation is if people are threatening to strangle or attempting strangulation, that is one of the biggest risk factors that we're aware of across all domestic homicides. Strangulation is very difficult to pick up in terms of forensics because it leaves very few marks on the victim's neck. So if you're working with families or working with individuals where somebody has disclosed that they've been strangled or partially strangled, either as a sexual activity or as a threat, again, red flag. Location of killing shouldn't come as any great surprise. The vast majority of all homicides are perpetrated at the victim's home address. Here we have the history of violence again, the co-occurrence of substance misuse and mental health issues. And then finally, this issue of coercive control. Now, coercive control as a concept is relatively recent in terms of applying it to domestic abuse. I've mentioned Evan Stark. Just as an aside, because we've got a few minutes, the whole concept of coercive control came out of the Korean War. during the 1950s. And some of you will remember the two Iraq wars, or the Middle Eastern wars we had during the 1990s in this country, where airmen, Allied airmen, were being shot down and being brainwashed and were appearing on TV to promote some Iraqi propaganda. And what the Chinese did during the Korean War is they brainwashed an awful lot of American airmen who would then go onto movie reel, as it was back then, and say, no, the North Koreans are fantastic, the Chinese are fantastic, the communists are fantastic, blah, blah, blah. That was the earliest recorded example of coercive control having been used. Evan developed those ideas and applied them to intimate relationships. So it's a relatively common, relatively recent phenomenon in terms of conceptualizing some types of domestic abuse. There is an awful lot of coercive control out there. Again, I'm not here to minimize, but in terms of approaching all domestic abuse as containing an element of coercive control, I think would be a mistake. As I've said, the scenario with the elderly lady who killed her 40-year-old son, absolutely no evidence of coercive control. I would say 30% of the homicide reviews that we review on behalf of the Home Office, there is no coercive control and no evidence of coercive control. So as things currently stand, we know there is a significant percentage of coercive control in IPV homicides and in adult family violence homicides, but I'm not here to tell you it's something you should be looking out for. It's something you should be aware of, but it's certainly not, in my professional opinion, 100% prevalent. This next slide I've included, we absolutely don't have any time today to look at these links. I've included them here just for reference, for information. I'd encourage you after the masterclass to have a look at these domestic homicide reviews and see if you can pick out any of the themes or any of the issues that I've been talking about in this session today. Certainly the three I've chosen differ in context, and if you're the kind of individual who likes to take work away from workforce development training sessions, try and apply the theories that I presented earlier in the training to these homicide reviews and look at the aggravating factors, look at the risk factors associated with that. And as David said right at the start, Lambeth is due to publish in the not too distant future another adult family violence domestic homicide review via their community safety partnership web pages. So I'd encourage you, when that is published, to take a look at it. Right, so we're moving on now to responses, and you're all saying, thank God, Simon, because there's only 10 minutes left. Now, the central message here, and I'll say it at the start and I'll say it at the end, is I'm expecting you all to respond to adult family violence in exactly the same way as you'd respond to intimate partner violence. You use the same pathways, and notwithstanding I poo-pooed the dash a wee bit, you use the dash, you use the same pathways, you use the same safeguarding processes, irrespective of whether you think it's adult family violence or intimate partner violence. And I don't think I need to reiterate why that is, because I've linked the similarities between adult family violence and intimate partner violence. We've looked at the prevalence, we've looked at the impact. It's nasty, it needs addressing. It's not just another domestic, it's not, well, it's adult family violence, it's a dysfunctional family. That dysfunctional family has needs. So we've looked at why there is no strategy, there isn't any guidance, there is no policy, there is no risk assessment. Why is this? Is because the etiology, the background, the evolution of our current responses is embedded in feminist activism, and that's entirely appropriate. Great, I love them for it. My challenge now is to produce something for practitioners which enables us to better respond to adult family violence. As part of that, I found the funding for a 3-year PhD full-time course at Anglia Ruskin University for the lovely Chen Trang. Chen Trang also works as an independent domestic violence advocate for Standing Together, so has a wealth of experience in terms of addressing intimate partner violence, and her research project is to develop a better understanding of the factors and the dynamics underpinning adult family violence. Now, I've woven in her interim findings to all of the slides that I've been presenting today, so this isn't all my own work. I've relied heavily on Chen Trang to provide some of the academic reading and some of the case studies which I've relayed to you. And our joint aim is to develop a practical response. Some of you may have come across, and if you haven't, I'd strongly encourage you to do this, AVAs, Against Violence and Abuse, they have a toolkit called Complicated Matters, which is a toolkit for practitioners to respond to domestic abuse, sexual violence, and mental health and substance misuse issues. My dream, if you like, is quite a small one. What I would like to see is that toolkit or similar toolkits be amended to include sections on responding to adult family violence, which recognise where the synergies are, where the differences are, and have some real practical tools within that document, so practitioners can relate to it, can refer to it, and aren't trying to read in between the lines. So from an academic perspective, I've included a whole list of references at the end of these slides. You can see what the academic response is. We're seeing more needs to be done based on the interim research, and as I said, myself and Chen Trang at Anglia Ruskin are trying to further that academic research to enhance practical responses. As a precursor to joining the session today, you should have received a leaflet which was put together by Standing Together in 2019. It was actually put together by Chen Trang, who I've said works there as an IDVA, on practical responses. And I'd encourage you to keep that on file or keep it about your person and refer to it. Everything I've discussed today, all of the issues I've discussed today are encapsulated within that professionals leaflet. And I'll reiterate the key points from it. Never equate a victim's lack of engagement with an absence of risk. I discussed right at the start when we were talking about prevalence that the vast majority of people will not disclose and will not engage with agencies with reference to their experiences of victims or as perpetrators. There are numerous personal and structural and societal reasons why people won't do that. Individuals might have had negative experiences of services in the past. They may not be able to self-identify. They've minimized the risk, etc., etc., etc. It's not for individuals, it's not for Joe Public to identify and assess their own risk. It's for us as practitioners. And instead of seeing a lack of engagement as a negative reflection on the individual, we should be perceiving that lack of engagement or those barriers to engagement as additional risk factors. We've talked about the additional key risk factors, substance misuse, care and relationships, history of violence, etc., etc., etc. There is nothing new there. Third bullet point here, look beyond the primary victim in the incident for risk to other family members, especially if there's a vulnerable adult in the family. What we haven't had time to talk about is retaliatory violence or mutually controlling violence. So within families, within relationships, I'm sure you're all aware, and we talked about status change and status inconsistency earlier on. At various points in all relationships, power will shift from one place, one individual to the other. And some individuals will use violence and abuse as a retaliatory method to offset the violence and abuse they've already been subjected to by another member of the household. So what I'm encouraging, what Standing Together are encouraging you to do here is to take a holistic view of that family. Don't rely on the kind of stereotypical dynamics of the male perpetrator and the female victim. None of those are helpful in terms of understanding kind of the real life lived experience of the families we are charged with supporting. And the kind of final point of that sentence there, especially if there's a vulnerable adult in the family, because again we see violence and abuse being used by vulnerable adults as a response to their own needs, their own kind of inability to express themselves, especially if they're cognitively impaired, etc., etc. So let's not label people without a full and thorough assessment. Point 4 is highly relevant to a homicide review that I'm looking at the current time. So police bail perpetrators of IPV or as adult family violence perpetrators being bailed to the parent's address. If there is no other address, then what we see is the police bailing both males and females back to the parent's address and increasing the risk there. Number 5 is a real practical response. I'm assuming the vast majority of you listening today are kind of universal or generic or safeguarding specialists. Cases of adult family violence typically require a specialist response. Now, you may find that your local IDVA service or your DA specialists are targeting female victims of intimate partner violence and coercive control predominantly, but they are your your kind of agreed, your best practice pathway in terms of adult family violence as well. You may have to twist a few arms, if that's not an appropriate term, to encourage your specialist services to respond to adult family violence in the same way as they would to IPV, but that's their role. We are charged with responding to that national definition of domestic abuse. And then the final point, I would extend that adult safeguarding to child safeguarding. If any of the issues, if any of the risks that we've discussed this morning come up in terms of assessment, then you need to be making the appropriate safeguarding referrals. Don't minimise risk. Don't think, well, it's a family issue, they'll work their ways through it. It's a safeguarding issue, the same as any other. Which brings me on to a point that I said I was going to bring up earlier on. Your universal assessments, your safeguarding assessments, your family assessment tools, those are by far and away the best assessment tools to identify and respond to adult family violence. Don't waste your time looking for a specialist adult family violence risk assessment tool. There isn't one. If you have to use the DASH as part of a referral pathway, then by all means do so, using the professional judgment element at the start. But your universal, your family assessments and your safeguarding assessments, that's where you need to be teasing out the context. That's where you need to be teasing out the impact, the risks, and also, if you're able to, the causality and the drivers. So just to finish up, in terms of practical responses, I'll reiterate my key message. Treat adult family violence as you would any other type of domestic abuse. You need to consider and act on risk. If you minimize risk, if you say it's just another domestic occurrence within that family, or it's just a family dynamic, bad things are going to happen. The second point, which I'd encourage you all to consider, and again, this comes from the AVA toolkit, Complicated Matters. There are 5 central messages, and I've used this in workforce development trainings for donkey's years. And it's as relevant to victims of adult family violence as it is to victims of partner violence. We need to reassure people making disclosures or coming to our attention through assessment, you are not alone. I've evidenced through discussion on prevalence that we are talking tens, if not hundreds of thousands of individuals in this country are impacted by adult family violence. The second bullet point, I believe you. Because you've been on this training, you've heard the evidence, you've seen the theoretical underpinnings, you've seen the practical case studies. Why would we seek to minimize? Why wouldn't we believe? Okay, we're inclined to believe a storyline on EastEnders or Coronation Street. Why do we find it sometimes so difficult to understand and believe the clients in front of us? You are strong. When I was talking about that cost-benefit analysis, well, one of the costs is, well, actually, I'm going to come across as a victim. I'm going to come across as weak. I can't control my own children. I can't control my son. I can't control this individual. By coming forward and making the disclosure, by talking about their experiences, they're evidencing that they are strong. And you have to promote the idea that recovery is possible, because otherwise the next time they come to formulate that cost-benefit analysis, it'll be on a very depressive, a very downbeat kind of basis. If you can't recover, if you can't get over, if you can't escape the violence of abuse, what's the point of bringing it to agency attention? And then finally, the last element to consider, think family, which should be familiar to all of us by this time. Consider if an adult child, I don't know, a 38-year-old male is perpetrating violence abuse against his 69-year-old mother, what is the lived experience of his children and his spouse or his partner? Can we say if he's abusing his parent or his carer, then there's an increased likelihood of him abusing his children and his partner? I think we can. So the last 2 bullet points, I'd encourage you again, as I've said, to use your local risk assessment tools, pathways and services, and always, always, always consider and act upon safeguarding concerns where adult family violence is a suspicion or is presenting. So by way of conclusion, and we are dead on 12:30, according to my phone anyway, adult family violence is little understood and researched, but it's a highly prevalent issue. We all have problems with conceptualizing the issue of adult family violence, and we all have issues with responding to it. And then finally, in bold, once again, where you identify adult family violence or the risk associated with adult family violence, you must treat it as though it was intimate partner violence. Do I agree with that? Absolutely, I agree with that. Domestic abuse of all kinds is a societal issue. It's not a criminal justice issue. We can't resolve, we can't prevent, and we can't stop domestic abuse by relying on statutory interventions. We can't rely on criminal justice interventions to address this. When we start looking at the theory behind all domestic abuse in a way, we'll see that it's embedded, it's ingrained, and it's entrenched in societies across the world. It's not specific to the UK or to England and Wales. Certainly, when I have been asked about perpetrators and how to influence perpetrators and change perpetrator behaviours, it's difficult because I'll generalise here, but we all know a perpetrator. I'm not going to make any disclosures here, but I've been unpleasantly surprised throughout my life that individuals who are very close to me and I've been friendly with or I've worked with over the years have tendencies or have certain characteristics which to me as a professional flags, are red flags. And is it appropriate to stick a poster under their nose or stick some guidance under their nose? Absolutely not. It isn't. I've found that the biggest changes can be affected through conversations and empathetic kind of understanding of the situation that those individuals are in. I'm not a great one to finger point, as you probably tell. I've used that phrase a few times already. I'm much more about empathy and understanding where individuals are coming from. From an academic perspective, I don't believe in concepts of good and evil. I think it's those social constructs based on formal religious doctrine. So I personally want to understand the background. I want to understand the context. I want to understand why people are behaving the way they are, because I think we're more able to find resolutions through that process than we are through finger pointing or relying on criminal justice interventions. That isn't to minimize at all the behavior or excuse the behavior of these individuals. It's just nothing exists in a vacuum. There are reasons why individuals perpetrate violence and abuse, and I think the more we understand what those reasons are, the better we're in a position to respond to them. I think we need a new set of social norms. I don't know if tolerance is the right word. I'm at pains to say I don't tolerate any violence and abuse. What I try to promote is empathy and empathetic ways of thinking. I don't think, as I said, othering or criminalising perpetrators is always appropriate for a number of different reasons. Obviously, there are those who absolutely deserve a criminal justice intervention and whatever that brings with it. But I don't think that's going to resolve anything. I don't think, and the statistics show this, locking people up doesn't resolve the issue. It just puts it aside for a wee while. When I'm doing training with police, and I'm not trying to, I'm trying to think of a phrase without, I'm not trying to urinate on their parade. When I say to them that we could arrest all the perpetrators of domestic abuse in Cambridgeshire tomorrow, and the day after we'd still have domestic abuse being reported to the police, because, as I say, it's ingrained, it's embedded. Where I'm coming from in trying to differentiate the types of domestic abuse, following Johnson and others, is I recognise, and it kind of dawned on me as a practitioner, that one size in terms of response never fits all. We need a needs-based response to all types of domestic abuse, and what we have at the current time is what I call a hopper model. So if you imagine a grain hopper, there's a very wide opening and a very narrow tube, and all of the grain goes into that very wide opening and is funneled down that very narrow tube. So if we think of the wide opening as being the definition of domestic abuse, which is why we started with defining our terms, so all domestic abuse that's disclosed comes to us through that definition, and it's a very broad church, but we tend to funnel it down a pathway, if you like, which includes MARACs and IDVAs and freedom programs and perpetrator interventions and risk assessment processes and all those things which are great and fantastic. I'm glad we have them, but they're targeted towards intimate partner violence. And typically intimate partner violence perpetrated by a man against a woman where there is coercive and controlling behaviours. So that's great. There's an awful lot of that about, and those interventions and that pathway is entirely appropriate for victims and perpetrators of intimate partner violence where there is coercive and controlling behaviour. But what happens if those dynamics are not the cause of the abuse and the violence? What happens if it's, as we'll see in a wee while when we get into theory, what if it's more situational? What if it's more structural? What if it's about individual psychologies and pathologies? Putting somebody into a perpetrator program which is designed to challenge their patriarchal beliefs when it's not the patriarchy which is driving their violence and abuse is counterproductive. And I would suggest one of the reasons we see a large dropout in terms of attendees of perpetrator programs is because it's not addressing their needs. Similarly, with victims of DA, again, I'm not sure about specifics in Lambeth, but certainly in Cambridgeshire and most of the counties in the Eastern region, victims, if they're at the high end of risk, will go to a MARAC, again, which is great, will be referred to a freedom programme or something similar. But again, the freedom programmes, those types of interventions are designed to enable survivors to understand the dynamics of a coercive and controlling relationship perpetrated by a man. If the perpetrator is your adult female daughter and you're being sent on a freedom programme, how does that help? So in terms of kind of getting back to the question, is the idea of a situational analysis or a perspective more tolerant? Then perhaps it is, and we all have the potential to perpetrate domestic abuse by that national definition. We all have the potential to be victimised through domestic abuse on the basis of that definition. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Again, I'll reiterate, my central message is not to minimise or deny or say anything's less risky or less harmful. What I'm saying is, in terms of responding to these issues, our current responses nationally and typically locally are targeted towards IPV and not adult family violence. So we need to be inventive in terms of longer term interventions. We need different interventions. We need different resolutions. Now, I mentioned adolescent violence against parents and carers earlier on, and we've started formulating better responses to that. So there are a couple of programs that I'm aware of that are available nationally called Break for Change, which is typically run through youth offending services, or non-violent resistance, NVR, which was developed in Israel, and both of those interventions recognise that parent control or patriarchal dynamics are not necessarily underpinning that type of abuse where younger people are perpetrating against the parents and carers. It's a much broader church. It's more about intergenerational conflict. It's much more about communication styles or the absence of emotional intelligence. So we'll come on to that under theories in a wee while. Does adult family violence, including domestic homicide, tend to be impulsive or premeditated? Unfortunately, Anonymous, it's both. It's either or it's both. And we'll touch on this in a wee while in terms of theories, if we had more time to kind of look at the statistics, the figures around differentiating domestic abuse and which fall into which category and all the rest of it, what we see, and we will talk about perpetrator typologies in a wee while, what we see is there are a range of different perpetrators with a range of different kind of drivers, if you like. Some are limited to, again, I'm trying to keep this as non-academic as I can, but there's a theory within criminology called lifetime criminology, which essentially is if you are a villain, for lack of a better word, as a younger person, you will keep that kind of mentality and those behaviours throughout your life course. You will typically be premeditating your activities to get whatever it is you want out of life. Then we have the other, which is more situational in nature, which is it's impulsive. It's a response to specific triggers. So I mentioned some of those triggers: alcohol, mental health, alcohol misuse, mental health issues, etc., etc., etc. stresses and strains, about finances, about accommodation. All of those can kind of create an impulsive environment where abuse is perpetrated. It's very difficult to tell, as we'll see in a wee while, what the motivation behind it is. It requires an awful lot of assessment, and often a psychological assessment, which is easier said than done these days. So what I'd encourage attendees to focus on is kind of the need of the victim, of the survivor, but also the needs of the perpetrator, and trying to establish what those needs are. So, for example, if those needs are that the perpetrator or the individual perpetrating the violence and abuse is narcissistic, that is a need, they have the need for attention, those types of things, identify those needs and work on those needs. Those needs will indicate what the drivers are, more so than any kind of formal domestic abuse risk assessment such as the DASH. Okay, so this is a question again around causality, which I'm delighted with. So yes, the impact of adverse childhood experiences. I don't know, Viv, whether you've come across that phrase before. ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. The theory is that if you experience an adverse childhood experience, or bad things happen to you as a child, then there's an increased likelihood of you doing bad things as an adult, or getting involved in bad things either as a perpetrator or a victim. Yes, sound research, sound theory, can't really argue with it. What I would say, though, is we need to consider protective factors, because not everybody who grows up with an adverse childhood experience goes on to perpetrate. There is an increased likelihood. And what I would say is those adverse childhood experiences can start pre-birth. So there's some fantastic research came out of, I think it was Sweden and Norway last year, where they were looking at fetuses that had experienced trauma in utero, in the womb, and the various chemicals and the various hormones flying around mum's body. So let's imagine mum is a victim of something herself, be it intimate partner violence or some other type of kind of adverse experience. Then while she's pregnant, she is producing cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and various other hormones, which can have an adverse experience on the unborn child even before it's born. So it's not just, this one's not just about attachment. It's not like post-birth attachment. This is pre-birth as well. Again, I like, is like the right word? I appreciate the ACEs theory, because it's empathetic. It seeks to understand why people behave the way they do. I said earlier, not everything exists in a value, nothing exists in a vacuum, and understanding the motivation behind perpetrators is surely the best way of addressing this issue in the future. So where there have been adverse childhood experiences, or there's been some kind of a severed attachment, then yes, we would expect to see an increased risk. I would also just raise here about children who've been in local authority care or have had that attachment disrupted somehow. Again, we see an increased risk or a suite of risk factors in terms of perpetration of violence in later adult life. Some do and some don't, Anonymous. It very much depends on the typology of the individual. As I was trying to get across in that section where we were talking about typologies and theories, some people feel entitled to perpetrate violence and abuse, and it's normal for them. So the scenario goes something, well, you've said something, you've challenged me, I don't like that, I am better than you, I am more powerful than you, therefore I will make sure it doesn't happen again, and I will put down your challenge through violence or abuse. There are others who are motivated differently, so it could be situational, and I talked about that, the difference in patterns. So, and I talked about peaks and troughs. So during those troughs, for example, what we find is there is a subset of perpetrators who will feel regret and remorse about their behavior in those troughs. That's why we get those troughs, and we end up with this kind of wave pattern rather than the escalating pattern that Evan Stark and friends kind of promote. That is a very good question, because there is a significant difference of opinion here and some contradictory research. So in England and Wales, so I mentioned the crime survey for England and Wales earlier on. If you look at the Office for National Statistics and their research on domestic abuse, They have a lovely graph which shows that the vast majority of people who are victimised through domestic abuse of all types typically earn £10,000 or less. So that would very strongly suggest that socio-economic status is a risk factor. And certainly I would agree with that to a point, because if you looked at in terms of resolutions or how you would escape an abusive relationship, be it a familial or an intimate one, if you have a healthy bank balance, then you are better able to escape and resolve. You can move out, you can do whatever. If you are on benefits or you've got a very low income, then you're kind of trapped, you're kind of isolated by your socioeconomic status. So there is some truth. I would also say in terms of geographical hotspotting, the vast majority of reported domestic abuse occurs in a lower socio-economic demographic area, or geographical area, if you like. But that could be for any number of reasons. It could be the additional stresses and strains from living in that area. It could be proximity to neighbours. We haven't spoke about third-party reporting. A third of all police reported incidents come from third parties, so neighbours hearing things coming through the wall. If you live in a lovely mansion in a posh part of Cambridge, where all the Cambridge University lecturers live, it's far less likely that anybody's going to hear what's going on in your house. If you live where I do, which is an ex-council house, and I've got a house on either side, you can hear exactly what's going on through those walls. So there's something about third-party reporting, there's something about proximity and the built environment, definitely, which would tie into the socio-economic discussion. However, the World Health Organization research that I cited earlier from 2013, there's a lovely map, a global map, and they looked at the prevalence of violence against women and girls, intimate partner violence, across the globe regionally. And they also looked at socio-demographic groups. And what they found was that women who are what they call high earners were just as likely to be victimized as anybody else. They didn't unpick that and say, well, actually, the harms caused to that better off group are lessened by the fact that they've got a bank account and they can kind of escape and they can leave and all the rest of it. But the bottom line was you're just as likely to be abused if you're rich as you are when you're poor. And certainly my practical experience does nothing to kind of dismiss that. When I've worked with local women's aid and refuge, and I've attended freedom programs or facilitated programs, it's a real cross section of society. So my personal understanding at this time is the message and the research is contradictory. I understand the fors and against on both sides, but my personal experience is everybody's at risk. But how one would go about mitigating or escaping that risk differs by socio-economic group. Okay, well, the party line or the official kind of message from the Home Office would be perpetrator interventions. But I've already mentioned there are limitations to formal perpetrator interventions as we understand them. So the Duluth model, so Duluth, Minnesota developed this model of perpetrator intervention during the late 70s and early 80s, which we have adopted. If you're familiar with the organization called Respect and Respect Accredited Perpetrator Interventions, they're based on this Duluth model, which is typically around addressing power and control. So if you have a man who's a perpetrator who is motivated by patriarchal power and control, then a perpetrator program based on the Duluth model is probably about as good an intervention as you're going to get. If we're looking at different typologies, and if we're looking at narcissistic individuals, those with borderline personality disorder and other kind of mental health issues, what we'd be looking to is specialist clinical interventions. And the best evidence that we have at the current time is it's a combination of motivational interviewing, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, and one-to-one counselling are most effective with those individuals. If you want to learn more, Kim, I would suggest you have a look at the College of Policing's website. So on that College of Policing website, they have an evidence base for relevant interventions, and you go on to what works, and there's a whole table there, and it will give you a whole load of interventions, be it with victims or perpetrators of DA. You click on the evidence base for evidence in terms of working with perpetrators, and there are all kinds of academic documents and reviews there which raise awareness of the best interventions. But certainly, if we're talking about, and I hate to say the word, a bog standard, but if we're looking at a male perpetrator who has misogynistic and kind of entitlement issues, then certainly a Duluth-based model via Respect accredited program is as good as you're going to get. If it looks more complicated, or it's assessed as more complicated than that, and good luck to you in terms of securing these interventions. But what we're looking for is motivational interviewing, CBT, and some one-to-one psychological intervention. More often than we would like them to, but I will qualify this. So there's a lovely chap. He's a criminologist called Chad Maruna, and Chad. His specialism is about rehabilitation and recidivism, and he wrote a very accessible piece last year. If you remember the London Bridge stabbings from last year, and the perpetrator was a terrorist and had been through a rehabilitation program, etc., etc. And one of the students was actually one of my students from Anglia Ruskin University, Saskia. And there was a bit of a media storm in terms of, oh God, these programs don't work, they're a waste of money, blah, 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 blah. Now, Chad says, and this is what I think about rehabilitation and any type of intervention. Chad talks about diet plans and online diet plans. Now, in theory, if you sign up for the Cambridge diet, or the diets are available, for example, if you follow that to under the letter of the law, then you would expect that program to be successful and you to lose weight, because on paper it looks great, in theory it's great, but life is more complicated than that. So for every one individual, every two individuals who goes on a weight loss program or a diet program, one of those two individuals will lose weight, will then put weight back on for all kinds of different external circumstances. It could be stress, it could be the loss of a loved one, it could be anything. Perpetrator interventions are exactly the same. In theory and on paper, they should work 100% of the time, but what they can't take into account is external drivers and external aggravators which will undo the good work that's been done in those programs. This is assuming, of course, that perpetrators go on these programs with the best of intentions. Okay, so again, there's a link here to weight loss programs. So let's say I was obese and I went to see my GP, and my GP says, okay, you can't have that operation until you lose some weight. Then I'm feeling as though I'm being somewhat coerced into losing weight, and I'm less likely. I might lose the weight initially because I want that operation, but I'm then more likely to put the weight back on because it wasn't me actually wanting to lose the weight in the first place. So it is with perpetrator interventions, especially where children are present. So what you find is that it'll either be a court order or be part of a parenting plan or a child protection plan. Thou shalt go on this intervention, thou shalt go on this perpetrator program. Now, some perpetrators will go on the programs and actually want to change. Some are going on there because they're mandated to or they're coerced to. The likelihood is if you're mandated or coerced onto a program, you're less likely to benefit from that program in the longer term. So there's some, again, if you're interested in research into the effectiveness of perpetrator programs, please get in touch with me and I'll send you the most recent literature. What benefits perpetrator interventions do show primarily is that there is a reduction in violent acts. There is less good evidence that perpetrator interventions change the underlying kind of mentalities or motivation for the abuse. But as far as I'm concerned, we'll take the wins where we can. Yes, we may not be able to challenge the underlying perceptions of these individuals, but at least if we can stop them raping or physically abusing, that for me is some kind of success.